Yeah, my name is Kevin Clayton, and I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's discussion. And I first would like to thank Charities at Work that consist of Global Impact, EarthShare, and Community Health Charities. And just want to give a little extra shout out to Community Health Charities as I actually, as of last week, am the board chair of this amazing organization. So thank you again, Charities at Work. So again, my name is Kevin Clayton, and I am the Vice President of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement for the Cleveland Cavaliers. And just by way of background, and I just want to level set for a moment, just kind of to provide a historical perspective of where I've had an opportunity to serve and do work. My career started off at Procter & Gamble on the sales and marketing side, and have also held stints as the leader of diversity and inclusion as either Chief Diversity Officer or VP of Global Diversity and Inclusion at United States Tennis Association, Russell Athletic, American Cancer Society, Bon Secours Mercy Health, and again now with the Cleveland Cavaliers. So just by way of background, what I want to do is to take about 15 minutes to provide you with a discussion in 3 areas. We'll talk about I want to give context from a background standpoint of some of the work in which we're doing right now with the Cavs. I want to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on diversity, engagement, and inclusion. And then we'll begin to talk about what do we do next? What do we do now? You'll have an opportunity to put any questions that you may have actually in the Q&A segment, not in the chat. And I'll make sure I'll answer as many of those as I possibly can. Additionally, I'm going to go through this first part kind of as quickly as I can because I think the real discussion that is going to take place is going to be coming from your questions. So with that, let me go ahead to the next slide. Yes, this is a shameless plug for the fact that we are a champion, and I'm a Cleveland native, and this was one of the great moments when the Cavaliers actually won the championship back in 2016. But it's not really to brag about the Cavs. I do want to give you some context. Next slide, please. Because when people hear the Cavaliers, when people ask me, well, what do you do? Well, the reality is I represent 5 different properties as Vice President of Diversity, Inclusion, and Engagement. So yes, it is the Cavaliers, which is our professional basketball team. It's also Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse, of which we have well over 200 events that we host during the course of a year that include basketball, hockey, concerts, truck pulls, Disney on Ice, and everything in between that you would see normally at either a field house, arena, or convention center. The Cleveland Monsters also are one of our properties, and the Cleveland Monsters are the American Hockey League affiliate to the Columbus Lumberjacks. So we do have a hockey team. The Canton Charge, which is the G League that feeds into the Cavaliers, kind of our minor league team for the Cavaliers. And also we have an esports team called the Cavs Legion. And the Cavs Legion is really our new introduction into the gaming and sports arena. And it's really a big part of our future. So that's from a context standpoint, the kind of connecting points and responsibility that I have leading our diversity and inclusion efforts. So let me talk about COVID-19 and the impact. And I want to share with you very specific examples. And these examples I'll share with you some of the things that we were faced with, as well as I think about you and some of the seats in which you sit in as it relates to either being corporate responsibility officers for corporations, nonprofit leaders, community leaders, or whoever it is that we have out here now looking at the call or listening to the call. And I want to first start with our team member engagement. So for perspective, as I mentioned, there's 5 properties in which we have over 500 team members. And for the most part, we work day in and day out together, really in a close environment. And on March the 13th, when Rudy Gobert actually changed the whole face of America by being the first professional athlete that was diagnosed with COVID-19, that changed everything that we did. Because the very next day, that game happened at maybe 8, 9 o'clock Eastern time. By 10:30 that evening, our senior leadership team was on a call. The NBA had sent out a notice to all the teams that business operations would now go on a hiatus. So that meant that what we had to do was to focus on how do we continue to engage our team members and what were the kind of things that were important. So what I want to share with you is the benefit of now the work from home. And although we had all the technology that you can imagine as being a professional sports team, quite honestly, we didn't use it from an engagement standpoint. We used it more from an analytical standpoint, from a statistical standpoint, but not necessarily engaging our team members. So the first thing that we noticed was once we started going to Zoom calls and Microsoft Teams and using all of those technologies, is that we began to have more authentic connections with each other. And what that meant was instead of our conferences and our meetings actually being in a conference room and everyone is kind of dressed in their business attire, although this is our business attire, we wouldn't really have personal interaction. So like right now, as I'm sitting in my office at home, as you look behind me and see all the things that represent kind of who I am in my office, those kind of conversations were happening with team members as we were having calls that had children coming in their room, that had pets in their laps, that were actually sitting outside on their porches or sitting in their playrooms or whatever it might be. So the authentic connections were now being made with team members because they were in their environment. There was a comfortability process that was taking place that really was not taking place in our office. And one of the things that we have done is we began to use a process that was called behind the curtain. And behind the curtain was part of our training process for our diversity and inclusion work, that we would ask our team members to actually put together slides or pictures of kind of who they are and their history. And we would have kind of huddles with team members to talk about who they were. And this was happening prior to us going on hiatus. So the behind the curtain, which was more manufactured as a presentation, actually now happened in real life as we were seeing actual team members in their environments, and it just created more of an authentic connection. It gave us more things to talk about. And one of the things that we've always focused on from a diversity and inclusion perspective and engagement perspective, let it be internally or externally, is that you have to have trust in order to have any kind of real gain in relationships. So the trust factor came in because now we were more familiar with each other. There was a certain level of comfortability that we had, as well as now authentic trust was being built out of that. So that's kind of from a team member engagement. So then moving on to the community engagement, which I just got to tell you, and being completely 100% transparent, it has really been killing me because my job is to engage in the community, as I do public speaking, as we do events, as I'm going to lots of different things across multiple dimensions of our community. So now I was challenged with how do I do that from sitting in my home, knowing that all of my community contacts and the work in which I do is really now going to be changed. So our team put together a series of what we'll call community mixers. And these community mixers were actually to have our community influencers across multiple dimensions of diversity, for us to actually invite them in for, and many of you have done the happy hours or what have you. So we would do happy hours around also having kind of business presentations, but it first started off with how do we actually engage communities. And I'll give you an example. The one that we recently did was with the Latinx community. And it's a community that we were beginning to actually get a lot of traction with prior to us going on hiatus. So with that, what we were able to do was we invited, by sending out these personal emails to the key influencers in the Latin community in Cleveland. And surprisingly, there's about a 10% population base of that particular demographic. And we had probably 15 to 20 different people that represented multiple dimensions, even within the Latin community. Let it be the Puerto Rican community, the Cuban community. And we were having a conversation around how is the pandemic affecting their community and what can we do to actually connect with them. And it wasn't an ask, we weren't trying to sell tickets. We were really talking about how can we authentically help you. So that then was multiplied within the LGBTQ community, the African American community, and several other communities in which we've had these community mixers or we have them planned, because it has now given us a totally different connecting point where these community leaders are saying, wow, you are actually reaching out to us at the worst time in our society's history to care about what our needs are. And we would have multiple members of our senior leadership on those community mixers. The last piece that I want to share with you from an impact standpoint has to do with what we call inclusion by design. And it was interesting because as I mentioned earlier, we started using Microsoft Teams more and some of these other platforms, whether it be Zoom, WebEx, or what have you. We were finding in some cases that we were using our biases to make assumptions around how our team members were engaging with us. So if you can imagine that we're now having all these different kind of plates or windows on our screens, and it's maybe 15 or 20 team members that are all in totally different kinds of activities. Let it be interacting with their kids, but yet they had to take this call. Someone who is maybe in the midst of also doing something around the house or whatever it might be. So as people were now being on these calls, what we were seeing is that we actually had to connect with them at a totally different level. So what we were able to do is actually meet people where they were. Some of the biases that I was referencing is that we had people that were making assumptions about how people were now interacting on the actual, during the presentation or during the actual conversation we were having. Those biases were playing off into us making assumptions around either they're interested or they're not interested. Either they're enthusiastic or they're not taking into consideration that people had all sorts of things going on that we never saw in the workplace. So when we talked about inclusion by design, we actually were focusing on making sure that we had people included on the calls that maybe weren't included before. We were asking our team members to give us the time in which worked best for them as to when they wanted to have calls, knowing that we had parents that were now doing self-schooling with their kids. And those are things in which we had never taken in consideration. So with that, when we talk about inclusion by design, it's making sure that we are not making assumptions about behavior based on either body language through our conversations. And then secondly, making sure that we are asking our team members around how they want to engage with us, what times work for them, what times don't, so that we can have the betterment of the majority of our team members versus us making assumptions. And the slide kind of disappeared again. So with that, what I wanted to share now is just maybe opening it up for some of the discussion. And I do have a couple of closing comments that I want to make around where we go from here. And it actually talks to, and I want to use a hockey analogy. In hockey, the anticipation of where the puck is going next is really key to the success in hockey. You don't take a look at the puck as to where it is now, you anticipate where it's going next. And I want to just tip into a moment. I just want to go into having a brief discussion relative to kind of the disparities that we're noticing from a health standpoint across demographics. Not to get into any of the science around why it is or how it is, but I think all of us have seen that Black and brown and underserved communities have been hit by COVID-19 at a much more significant rate than others. So as we are anticipating that from the standpoint of all the work that anybody on this particular call does, you are affected by the outcomes of how Black and brown and underserved communities are being affected. So there's a domino effect that happens. And that domino effect has to do with the fact that if we don't begin to look at how we get to these communities, to support these communities, as we are anticipating the next wave to come. So we know another wave is coming. We know that in the fall that there's going to be, through the flu, through the cold season, the projections are that COVID-19 is going to hit again. I was on a call earlier today and somebody shared with me the term of community malpractice, that if we don't anticipate what's going to happen next and prepare for that. So as I'm thinking about all of you on the call right now in whatever your endeavor is of work, we have to think about what's next, not what is now. And the what next has to do with communities are still going to be in need, and the communities of color are going to be in need. So we have to make sure that we're identifying how can we help now and engage those communities so that we don't get into a situation that we had a backup in our healthcare systems like we had before. So I'm going to take a moment to answer some of the questions that are out here. All right, so one of the questions that I see is, what surprised you most from the feedback in the mixers that we did? So the biggest surprise was how honest people were. And they were very direct and honest around what their needs were. And the reason why that was a surprise is because we've had meetings with some of these same community groups, and they haven't shared with us to that level of detail as to what was important. And we understood that afterwards of analyzing it from the standpoint that right now, because COVID-19 is impacting everybody at such a level of desperation and despair, that people were thinking, look, if I don't tell you right now what is going on, and you're asking how you can help, and therefore, if I don't tell you, that means no help. So that was really the candid honesty that we received that was a surprise to us. Another question that I have is, how have you been able to respond to mental health in needs of your team members? So one of the things that we did early on, well, it's actually two things that we did. One of the things that we did, and as some of you may or may not know, Kevin Love plays for us, and Kevin Love is a huge mental health advocate. And we actually had him record some of the, or he had already had some recordings out there of some things in which he was doing that we made available to team members. We also had internally with our kind of medical team, we would have information around getting support for mental health. And that's part of our team member wellness plan. And that's kind of each week we would have a different series of different opportunities for our team members to connect with other types of teams and resources that are out there where they can identify with how they can connect if there is an issue around mental health or they wanted to know more. So that's on an ongoing basis, and it's also kind of archived on our intranet for resources if anybody has a need to kind of deal with that. All right, another question that I have here is, do you feel like the Cavs have a unique role to play in reaching communities of color? Who are you partnering with on the ground to help communicate this message? So that's an interesting question. So I've been in my seat now for 14 months as the leader of our diversity and inclusion strategies. And the reason why I say that it's an interesting question is because what we have identified is when we begin to have conversations around kind of the diversity and inclusion, the first assumption is, oh, you're just focusing on communities of color. So as this particular question asks, what role do we play? Do we have a unique role? So we have a unique role to connect to all communities. It happens that as we do the analysis of communities that either are left out of our fan base, communities that are in need, the numbers kind of dictate to us that communities of color, we have a much stronger opportunity to connect with those particular fans and make sure that they feel included in all of our properties. So it's not that we have a unique position on any one community. We just don't want any community to be left out. So the other part two of the question is, who are we partnering on the ground to help in communicating these messages? As I mentioned earlier, that we have community organizations that we call influencers. So within the Hispanic community, there's a number of individual community organizations within the African American community. It's the NAACP, it's the Urban League, it's a lot of nonprofits that are doing this work. Recently, in partnership with community charities, community health charities, we were able to put together a convening, and that convening was a community convening where we brought together about 20 to 25 different nonprofits in Cleveland, and this was in conjunction with the Cavaliers, to talk about health opportunities and the social determinants of health. And that was all driven by those particular boots on the ground individuals in Cleveland. So I'm going to move to the Q&A. We got about 20 different questions in here. All right, so one question is, we do less work out in the communities and rather with specific charity partners. How are you finding ways to do volunteer work? So there are two levels of volunteering that we do, one of which falls underneath my responsibility and the other falls within our community relations team. So for my particular responsibility, I am responsible for putting together a kind of grid and a scorecard of all the nonprofit board opportunities that exist in Northeast Ohio, and then making sure that any of our 500 team members that want to participate and serve on community boards have that opportunity to do so. So that's one of the things that I'm responsible for doing. And from that, if you think about volunteering, not just around events, but also lending expertise to community boards, is something in which we have done. The other side of this has to do with our now kind of on the boots volunteering. And our community relations team actually puts together volunteer opportunities, and volunteering is one of our 4 major priorities as an organization. And we hold each other accountable. We log community volunteer hours. And now what we have done in this pandemic time is that we're moving to virtual volunteering so that we can still continue to volunteer, but we do it virtually. And we've aligned with several organizations that have given us input as to where those actual virtual opportunities are. The question is, what can we do immediately to help the underserved? Long-term is just as critical, but what are the immediate needs and how can we prepare for wave 2? So one of the things that we have done, we went to those communities, the underserved communities, let it be the Black or brown or poor communities. So we went to those communities and early on asked, what are the kind of things that we need? What can we do? So one example of what we have done is our building is dark right now because there's no events. And we partnered with the Red Cross to do a blood drive in our building, and the Red Cross came in and they made all the necessary safety precautions. And that was so successful that since then there have been 2 more that we have executed. So that was back in March. We've done one in May. We'll do another one in June. So it's how do we use our current resources to make sure that we are actually connecting with the communities of need. The other thing that I would suggest that you do is if you reach out to organizations like the Urban League, like the NAACP, like some of the Latinx community groups, and ask them what their needs are, that would be very helpful in engaging them. What is the biggest opportunity to take what you've learned in Cleveland to other cities? So fortunately or unfortunately, I've had opportunity to live in a number of other cities, and it wasn't out of not being able to keep a job. I've just had a great opportunity to have some great work assignments and career assignments. And the one consistent thing that I would say crosses all communities that I've done work in, and I've been very, very connected to local communities, is engage in influencers early on. Whatever organization you represent, make sure that you have a cross representation of demographics of who you engage with. One of the things that I have done that I might suggest to you is creating a community advisory group that reflects the demographics of the community in which your business is located or you do business in. I have done that across multiple cities and identify what the needs are of that particular community, not some kind of global plan that's 30,000 feet up and you're trying to kind of streamline that down. I start from the bottom up, and that way I have the support of those local community organizations that need the support. What is going to be your key priority as the new board chair of community health charities? That's going to be, that's an easy one to answer. We started on this journey around focusing on the social determinants of health to get back to our core around community health, community service, and how do we make sure that we are actually bringing resources to that level. So for me and helping to lead the organization, I'm making sure that the social determinants of health are absolutely priorities for our organization. And when we talk about what those are, because that might be a new term for some of you, we're talking about all of the indicators that actually lead to poor health outcomes. let it be food deserts, let it be transportation, employment, let it be the need for education. All of those particular elements are the social determinants that drive poor health outcomes. So we're going to make sure that we partner with charities and our charity partners to make sure that they're hearing our message and we can help translate some of those resources to them. So as we wind up, and I want to be very conscious of the time, I just want to share with you this last concept that's something that I heard very recently. And that is that we've heard, and if I had a penny for every time I've heard that we are in this unprecedented time, and it's unprecedented. Well, the reality is what's unprecedented is how quickly COVID-19 has hit and the numbers of deaths that have accumulated over a short period of time and how many people have been affected. What's not unprecedented is change. What's not unprecedented is the fact that we as a country, we as a community have always had to deal with the changing environment. So what I wanted to leave you with is not focusing on what's unprecedented. What's going to happen to corporations and organizations that if they don't think about what's moving forward, if they don't think about how they can prepare for change, they will be left behind. I have two very quick examples. One of which is if you think about the fact that once upon a time, most of us remember what Blockbuster is. Blockbuster is no longer in business because streaming became the way in which people watch movies and got entertainment. Blockbuster didn't keep their eye on what was to come. The second example, you cannot find a taxi cab in Cleveland, Ohio. And the reason why is because the taxi cab companies didn't see how transportation was going to change. And now transportation is changing where you have Uber and Lyft. So the point is that if we don't keep our eye on what the future trends are, then we are going to have, corporations are not going to be able to keep up. So I just want to inspire you to continue to do what you're doing and also to focus on what's next, not what is today. So on behalf of myself and the Cavaliers and also health charities, I thank you for listening to our broadcast today. And hopefully if you have any questions, I'll go ahead and answer these questions and we'll get them back out as well. So thank you.